Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and I am here with my magical, astrological, and actual friend, Rory Keys from London. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Jen. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today. And I just want to jump right in. What was the first book of astrology that you remember reading?
So, the first book of astrology that I remember reading is a very distinct one because, like many others you've had here on Within Orb, I did a lot of reading online, various sources, and living in London at the time, it was very magical to be able to go down to the old bookshops that have been there in some cases, 100 years or more, and have a look around. And I was already interested in the more esoteric side of astrology. And so this particular title jumped out to me. This is Astrological Magic by Estelle Daniels. Astrological with a K, magic with a K. And this was the first real astrology book I read. And it's an interesting one. In recent years, I've been rather critical of it, and I've recommended it to very few people. However, reviewing it again recently, I actually stand by my original position that it is an excellent introduction to astrology for a handful of reasons. I should say that it's written for, Estelle Daniels, she's in the pagan Wicca community. She's been doing astrology since 67, I think, and so she wrote the book because there's some Wiccan authority author out there who says you need to be able to interpret your chart with transits, progressions, and make predictions based on that, but there were no resources for their group to be able to do that. So she ended up writing this book as an answer to that. And what's interesting about it is that it focuses not so much on natal. There's a lot of things in there that are pertinent more to horary and electional. So for instance, in addition to your basic stuff, planets, signs, houses, she talks about the next aspect of the moon, the last aspect of the moon, the final significator, really juicy things that I think are hard to come by in most beginners' textbooks. And the other excellent thing I must commend her for is the incredibly casual and rather comedic writing style. You feel like you know her and that you're talking to a friend. And indeed, in the introduction, she does introduce you to herself. My only criticism that I still retain is an over reliance on the 12-letter alphabet and equating signs with houses on a one-to-one basis. But aside from that, it really is an excellent piece of work. And it's clear to me now, having reviewed it, how much it influenced my early journey and accelerated certain aspects of understanding in astrology.
Amazing. There's a few things I want to touch base on when what you just shared. Last aspect of the moon. That is actually not anything I've seen written. So that's a cool thing to know about the source, because that was shared with me from my first astrology teacher as a sort of rough and tumble way of doing electional, of like, I just always look for the last aspect of the moon and then I make my call. Do I pull the trigger now or now? And no planetary hour, no waiting for this or that aspect to perfect before this or that. It's more like just go to that little, and I mean, we did this together. This was in my high school. We would get the ephemeris out and just look in that little sector where you can see that listing of the last aspect of the moon before it changes sign. And make your delineation that way. But I mean, so I'm happy to hear that Estelle brings this up in her work.
Yeah, she writes in the introduction how she knew that she felt reluctant to write anything on astrology because either it's been written about before or it's being repackaged and it's the same material, or you have to find something entirely novel to write about, which she deemed far-fetched to accomplish, right? And so kind of she found her niche in the sense that there's a bunch of things that ought to go together for someone who knows a little bit about astrology, but not enough to do mathematics, right? And who needs the information for their magical or mystical practice. So she really did a good job, and I'm I want to make it known how much more appreciative I am of the text today, as I was when I first found it, rather than kind of the mild rejection I've been sitting with it for a couple of years or several years, let's say.
I'm really happy to hear that. And it goes along with some of the conversations I've been having with people lately of realizing, like, when we go swing on the spectrum or the teeter-totter too far to the traditional or classical, we lose sight of some of the really beautiful things that happen in the 20th century, you know?
Yes, there were great innovations for sure. You know, some of them, of course, are questionable. She has this great little line about how esoteric astrology and the rulers in esoteric astrology was invented by Alice Bailey, and no one can read her books anyway. You know, that's an example of the comedic style she uses, which I'm very appreciative of.
Yes, yes. So when we go back to that moment when you have had this book in your orbit and you're letting it wash over you, it's super inspirational. What are a couple of the things that she's shared that you put to practice that really have continued to be influential to you?
Well, you know, some of the things she goes over is planetary hours, which I recognize the importance of at that time. And, you know, there's more or less nothing that I do or don't do without ensuring I've checked the hour, and that it's at least amenable to my activities. I tend to structure my life around, well, I'll do this in that hour and I'll do that in the other one. So yeah, that would be an obvious example. And it's one of the things she writes briefly on. There's some other things in there. I think the lunar aspects as well, and next and last, is just sort of, you know, it was incredible to have it at that time, because as we were just saying, like, you're not really going to find it in a textbook, and you had it from mouth to ear, right? From your teacher. So yeah, those would be two good examples. There are other things in here, like she gives a description. There's a natal section which leans towards magic. She gives a description of, you know, if you're a Scorpio / 8th house magician, you'll lean into this kind of stuff versus a Sag or 9th house magician. Now we can put aside the house bit, right? But that stuff is really good. I was just reviewing that earlier today as well, and was surprised to see how much I continue to resonate with it today as I did in 2013 or maybe 2014 when I got the book. So
awesome. Yeah, that's a really impressive beginning, because you came through the magical door. And
yes, yeah,
it was actually around that time that I remember being in the Bay Area as Austin was finishing 36 Faces, or it had just been published, and he was saying the occult community and magical community really need to start talking to the astrologers. And 36 Faces was his attempt to make that conversation happen.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because 36 Faces I bought only a couple months later. It was the second magical book or astrological book I ever got. And I came across it because it was simply featured in Watkins' free magazine that they used to give when you made a purchase. They'd give you a magazine. And so it was in the magazine, and I recognized the word decans. And I think I had an awareness that there wasn't really any substantive material on those anywhere. And, you know, clearly this was a traditional bent with a lot of focus again on magic. And so that's where I was at. I was like, I wanted to find the magic astrology combo books rather than simply one or the other.
Yeah. And did you get the hardback or the paperback?
I got the paperback because I was a student at the time, and I have it here, and it remains in rather good condition and is here. And so for people just listening, on the front we have the image of a young lady in a red flowing dress floating above a stellar goat, and there's a triangle and a backdrop of stars behind them. And I'm aware that the hardback has a different front image, but this book it remains to this day to be something I refer to sometimes on a weekly basis. It is just full of wisdom and insight, and you know, it is a collation of all of the traditional excerpts on the decans from various texts. And so in terms of a masterpiece upon the 36 decans or faces, there is no greater source available to consult.
High praise for Austin Coppock, who is going to come out with a second edition because the book you have in your hands is out of print.
It is.
I invested in the hardback version, which is not yet in the library because I'm still coveting it. So we shall see. I'm hoping that there's a generous donor out there who wants to bestow a paperback version for the library use, because it's still one of my important texts as well that I keep dear. So
yes, and so I'm aware that the new version that is on the way with no firm date of expectation, I believe it is revised and edited, and there are certainly additional text and additional images, I believe. So I'm looking forward to it, and I will definitely be getting the new one as well.
Yeah, same. And there's always more to do, right? I mean, even Rob Hand's classic Planets in Transit is going to be coming out in a brand new edition at some point, I hear. So a lot of these classics are being reissued. But nevertheless,
Excellent.
so magic and astrology from Jump Street. Now, I'm going to send you on a trip, and you have a very small piece of luggage, and it's going to be perhaps to a very remote place, and you can only take certain things with you. We're going to assume that you have an ephemeris or a planetary hours app, something, to that effect. So your tools are there, but what are the 3 books that you would absolutely have on hand if you were going to be stranded with no access to Kaylee?
Yes. So stranded, if it's a desert island specifically, so I've kind of categorized these by different purposes to have them there, right? So the first one would be the translation of Valence's anthologies, simply to read. I find that's a tome you can just read and revisit over and over. And I've been, dipping in and out of it for many years now. And what I like about it is that it's, there are 9 books within it, and yet they are individual books almost. And there is, yes, some continuity in terms of you need to know this technique to be able to do this one later on, but they don't read exactly like a manual does. It's not like building a something. It's not like building a car, for instance. So I like it simply because there is what seems to be eternal reading value in it, and you can sort of dwell on books 1 and 2, for instance, and then once you've really read and reread and understood it, and perhaps some of it is simply Riley's translation at work, right? But once you've really understood it, then you can start to understand some of the things in 3, 4, and so on. So yeah, that's just one I simply love to read and provides me joy in reading.
Yeah. And then the point where you get to, he says you can, I think it's book 4, he's like, you can perfect actually from anything. And your brain falls out of your head. Like, how can
Yes. And so that, in practice, that becomes something you need to keep a check on. And I've found myself doing preparation for readings, and then suddenly I'm not only perfecting from the ascendant and the sect light, but also the lot of fortune and diamond, and maybe like 2 or 3 other points in the chart. And you think, you know what, I've got too much here to do. Let's take it back to just the ascendant and the sect light as a bare minimum. And the other thing, Jen, is that book obviously is kind of, in some sense, the foundation of what we modern astrologers use to inform a Hellenistic practice. And, annual perfections and zodiacal releasing are the big ones everyone knows about. But there are actually at least 2, if not 3, maybe more other timing techniques that are in there, which are very difficult to understand because of the way the sentences kind of are written. And so I encourage people, if they are so interested, to delve into those bits and attempt to understand for themselves. Because, again, as I was saying at the beginning of this particular example, there's one of those things where I know I have to read something else and then come back to it before I actually understand what he's trying to tell me to do.
Sure. So can you describe in rough terms what those 3 lesser covered timing techniques are like? Like, which factors are we looking at, and
There's only one I can actually explain because I
Okay,
understand it,
okay.
right?
So there's lots of
And
hidden treasure in book 4 of Valens.
yeah,
Go
yeah,
on.
there's a lot of hidden treasure bearing timing techniques, forecasting techniques. The one that I understand that is neither annual perfections nor zodiacal releasing is what Valens calls the 10-year, 9-month distributions of propitious and improprietous times. And it's actually more well known amongst revivalists of the Hellenistic tradition today than one would think. And it goes by the name these days of the decennials. And it's not only written about in Valens, but he says he originates it. He says that he invented this technique. But you can find it described much more simply and easier to follow by Firmicus Maternus and Mathesis. And what it is it's very similar to zodiacal releasing, but instead of beginning your count, so I should backtrack. We're doing a forecasting technique where we take the ruler of the sign of a zodiac to give a certain amount of years, and then months as a subset, and so on in smaller increments. And so it's using the same time periods for those rulers. But the way it works is, I think, much more interesting and enchanting, because you begin with the sect light, and then so it'll be the sun or the moon, of course. And so then you'll give the number of years to them for the first period. And then both for subsequent year or decade-long periods and the sub-periods that occur within each of those decade-long periods, you give the next one in order to the planet that occurs next in zodiacal order. So if you had Venus in the sign after the sun, Venus would have the next period of 10 years, 9 months. And if Mercury was, Mercury would have to be before the sun, I guess. So then if it was Jupiter, then Jupiter would have the next 10-year, 9-month period. And within that, the sub-periods follow the same order. So I think it's much more unique to each individual, because everyone's going to have a different spattering of planets in their specific orders around the chart, rather than you've got this lot in that sign, this lot in that sign, and you'll have these periods run out like this. So I think that's very interesting. It is difficult to understand when you read Valens.
Yes.
But if you read Firmicus, it's very approachable and easy to replicate.
Wow. I love that. I've seen someone go through my chart and say, okay, first comes this planet, then this one, and sort of narrate how things tend to happen, even just by transit. A planet the moon, for example, will first hit this planet, and then this one, and it becomes kind of a script. And you can do that with the solar return as well, where solar return itself becomes a calendar from the sun's position, and as the sun in the year of that life transits those points. But this is now operating on a whole holographic level of time from birth, of that same, first you stub your toe, then you rub your knee, then you get a pat on the back, like, that's Jupiter, right? So you have this kind of like macro level, like chain of events that happens based off of this lineup of planets that you chose with that first breath.
Yeah, exactly. And Austin Kobok, who I've studied with, used the analogy of the moon going through your chart as like keys on a piano being played in a certain order, right? And so if you follow the moon, you know what the melody is, and then other planets will play it forward and reverse as they retrograde and so on. But yeah, it's the same melody out on that holographic level, as you say. And I just find that so compelling. And it's even though it's a little newer to me, so I don't have the delineations quite down as much as I would with other systems, I do prefer it to zodiacal releasing for this kind of reason we've described.
Yeah, I did an art project with zodiacal releasing to try to wrap my head around the way the data is depicted for these time periods. So you said that the planetary units are the same. So Mars would get 15 units, Venus gets 8 units, and so on.
Jupiter 12, yes.
Does Saturn switch units between 27 and 30 with Capricorn and Aquarius in the decennial technique?
No, I think, I'm just going off the top of my head, I think it just gets 30 years, I want to
Okay.
say. And 30 years is the Aquarius period, isn't it?
That's for zodiacal
Yeah.
releasing.
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
they give it that because that's its preferred sect as a planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. I would have to look back. I think Firmicus tells us why, because they add up to a number. They add up to a certain
Okay.
number when you put them all together
Yeah,
without the
yeah.
28. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. That is awesome. And I love also how you'd have to spend that time marinating in just working through it for yourself to see what the pattern is, and then seeing enough charts where the pattern might shift and bend itself, etc. And so, that's not the kind of technique that you would just run into a consult and just be like, okay, this is how it's going down.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's much more of a broad view. And so it's something to mention, Jen, which is very much related to this and rather funny, just the way things kind of fall in place. One of the books that I have not brought today, because it's not strictly an astrology book, is Betts's translation of the Greek magical papyri in English. And the funny thing about that is that whilst not an astrology book, there are lots of instances of astrology in there, from like very simple things like these are the incenses you should burn for each of the planets, to more complex elections like make sure there's no malefic planets looking at the moon, have the moon in the east, have her full benefic with a benefic planet, right? And then there's one instance which puzzled me for years, and it is a description. It's like notes, really, that the person must have written down before having a consult with an individual. And this individual he was consulting for was at least 56 years old. And it looked like zodiacal releasing. So they're saying, oh yeah, Mercury gets 8 years. And then within that period, Venus has the next one. And then the sun, these years are good. And then, Jupiter, these years are good. Mars, these years are bad for the body, or these are hostile years, etc. And I looked at it and I thought, well, it can't be zodiacal releasing because the order isn't right. They're out of zodiacal order. And it really stumped me. I had no idea what it was, what it could be, until doing the third year of Austin's Fundamentals of Astrology. And he taught us this technique, which he called the decades. He called them the decades. And he was teaching us from Firmicus. And as he's talking about it, I realize I know what it is in the PGM. And so I shared that with him, and we were all kind of like blown away and stunned, because I never thought I'd ever figure out what this weird paragraph meant in the PGM. And yet somehow, fate brought all of these things together, and the right teacher with the right teachings. And just incredible. So it was after that I found Valens writes about it. And because he was in Alexandria for much of his life and traveled around Egypt, there's a possibility this author, because there are many authors of the PGM, they're a collection of papyri, right? But it's very possible that this specific author was a student of Valens, which again is just mind-blowing.
I love that potential lineage, just the sheer thought of it. You have this physical place and everybody's sharing information and recording it, and not necessarily saying, so my teacher told me this, right? He's just simply stating, I had a client, and
Yes, well, it's not even like that. It's more like it's as if he did the calculation and he wrote this down to remind himself of what to say when he speaks to the client. It's like that level of concise, because the delineations are, these are good, these years are bad for the body, right? It's very short one-liner types. But yeah,
I love it. I love it. And I love how closely you read and how you're able to put these things together through time and let something be confusing for a minute. And then I think there's like a spirit of the library somewhere, of all libraries, who just like taps you on the shoulders, like, Rory, this is it, here's your answer.
Yes.
Years later.
Thank you, spirit of the library.
I know, right? Yay. I've had books fly on. John Dee's Mona flew off the shelf at me. Mona's Hieroglyphicas, when I was a freshman in college. It was like, doink, just hit me on the head.
Time to read.
I know, right? It's just like, here I am. And I'm like, oh, that's a funky Mercury. What's going on here? It's like, now look. Okay, so that is the anthologies. Now there's room for 2 more books. What are you've got bets in your deep memory.
We're still the desert island. Okay, yes. So Okay, yes, yeah, I have 2 more books. Sorry, I thought we were further along. We're
No,
on
no,
the
no. We're
first
still,
one.
that's
Okay.
how big the anthologies is, right? You've got
Yes, it
9
is. It
books in there,
is.
and like we only
Yeah,
talked about book 4.
we
Um
almost did it justice. So, all right, the next one that I'm bringing with me, and I know that Thea gave the same answer. The next one is the Picatrix in this beautiful red cover. This is the translation by Dana Trell and David Horeca. And the reason I'm bringing this to the desert island is because there are at least 2 different operations in here, whereby one creates an object out of various metals or clay, like a jug shaped like a fish. And by creating this object under the right election and throwing it into water, one creates the ideal fishing spot where there will always be fish accumulating in that area. So I thought this would be ideal to have, because on a desert island, I'm going to want to ensure that I have plenty of protein available, and fish would be nice.
I can
So
see your
that's
brain
my
getting
logic.
larger by the second, right?
Oh
Like
no.
you're going to create a whole new iteration of Homo sapiens. It's going to be like Homo Rory or something, like, super
I'm
intelligent
not
human.
endorsing this.
No. Just, thinking about like how fish have catapulted our frontal cortex,
Oh,
as we,
right. Yeah, the
yeah.
omega
So
3s. Yeah, I'm
you're
all for that.
creating this
All for
magical
that.
fishing spot to
Well,
force
if I'm
multiply
going to
your
be there a long
astrological
time,
acumen,
yes. We're going to make the best of a bad situation, and at least we have books to read. But the other reason to bring it along, I don't know if there are scorpions on desert islands, but there are also a couple scorpion repelling operations to be done. So, there's plenty of other useful tools that are
Okay.
available to be constructed out of that book. So it seems like a worthwhile text, and possibly a necessity for one's survival on such a deserted island.
I mean, you could theoretically open up a whole part of your work showing people how to survive harsh environments using astrological magic alone, right? I mean,
that's actually a rather good idea, Jen.
But when you
Note
say
that down.
scorpion repellent, I'm thinking, why would you want to get rid of them? They have glow in the dark ink. They have UV sensitive ink in their bodies. Like their bodies glow under UV light. Not that you would have one of those on a desert island with no electricity, but I mean,
I suppose the first challenge is just getting regular ink that one can see with one's own eyes, rather than a kind of invisible. Would it be an invisible?
Well, it's after the fish. After the
UV?
fish, maybe your vision would have shifted to the
Perhaps.
extent of
I
seeing
hope so. That would be nice as well.
New spectrums of light. But yeah, I've always wanted to make ink with scorpion bodies because they glow in UV light. So I was trying to see if, like,
you have scorpions in the Americas. Do you know?
Yeah, in the South. So I have a friend who makes ink who lives in Arizona, and I want to keep tapping him on the shoulder. Like, give me some of those scorpions, but different project, different time. Probably not in the Picatrix because they weren't looking at things with UV light either, right?
No, I think there are inks to be made. There definitely are in the PGM, which we're not discussing. So there might be some inks in the Picatrix as well, because there are some interesting similarities, not necessarily in the operation or the purpose, but like the style of construction or the style of recipe. There's some similarity between the Picatrix and the Greek magical papyri, which I find very interesting.
Well, I mean, if you're going to elect to create a talisman, why wouldn't you make a talismanic ink?
Oh, precisely, yeah, and then you can write with it,
smear it everywhere, and talisman all kinds of things.
Yeah. Talismanic graffiti. I like that.
Yes. Oh, this is good. This is rich. It makes me also think of when Paracelsus was talking about the Jamahe. I don't know how to say that out loud. And who would either? It's early modern German, but maybe Latin. And he's talking about the creating a talisman with oil is like creating something that you can shine new light through, and then the oil contains the chart of the moment of construction, so that whatever you do underneath the smeared oil on the glass becomes imprinted. Like, so let's use Saturn as an example. Now Saturn's in Pisces, everybody's crying because they can't make Saturn talismans for another, like, when is it going into Libra? 20 years. But if you have had a Saturn oil of some kind over the last 5 years, you can smear it on a clear glass plate, and anything you do underneath that, when the sun is shining through that oil, it's almost like filter in Photoshop or something, so that the object
Yeah.
that gets created is not looking at the Saturn in Pisces in the sky, because the sunlight is showing the Saturn in Aquarius or Capricorn through that glass.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of yeah, like you say, like a tint, a sunglass tint, and you're irradiating magic through it. I like that a
Yeah.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, then you say like an ink, it's like, you know, talismanic graffiti. I think there's a lot of dynamic things we could be pushing the astrological magic a little bit with our art, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I think people, you know, they think about making a ring or a necklace or a pendant or whatever, and they're not thinking about creating something, for example, and throwing it in the river to bring more fish. They're not thinking about how can I create a pair of sunglasses which I can turn things into Saturn objects with. They're not thinking about the graffiti. Yeah, I think there's a kind of punk revolution that can be
unleashed with this podcast episode.
Yes, officially.
So everybody go out there and do it. Okay, so wrapping up your desert vibe. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. One last text.
Okay, so this one, again, for practical purposes, I will be bringing... This is Benjamin Dyke's translation and edition of the Carmen Astrologicum, the Umar al-Tabiri translation. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, this is translated into English from Arabic, from an earlier Persian language, one of Dorotheus's work, right? The reason to bring this is because it has, and I should say actually, like, this book is it's kind of like subtitled, I think, on questions, or that's one of the sections in the book. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we all kind of agree for the most part that Hellenistic astrologers weren't practicing horary astrology. But when you read this, it's hard not to think they're getting awfully close with some of the things they're doing. You know, like someone stole my object. Who is the thief? Where is the thief? Right? And then they're looking at a chart to determine who the thief is, where the thief has gone, can they get the object back? You know, what will happen to the sick person? And so the reason I'm bringing it to the desert island is because there's a section at the back here somewhere where one is given the appropriate election to construct a boat. So
you are hell-bent on getting out of this idyllic place with no internet and it's quiet.
I didn't say it was idyllic. Sorry, I thought it was kind of...
No, you're acting like it's already hostile. There's scorpions. You've got to. There's no food. You've got to...
just like having the options, right? So I'm going to make sure there's fish. This is so
extreme.
Make sure I'm free of scorpions, and if I wish, at least I have the appropriate election when it comes around to build a boat. Should I want to get off? And there's a similar one that follows immediately after on when you should push the boat into the water for the first time. You know, and sometimes it's like, well, under this configuration, there'll be like a wave that will destroy your boat. So don't use that mood side, so on.
That would be best avoided. What I'm also learning though is I love this too, because there's people I'm in contact with in the UK who study continuity of prehistoric cultures. And what you're also suggesting here from the beautiful city of London is that there's perhaps a little more continuity in the development of horary than we've been given, or we have awarded attention to.
Yeah, you know, I can't say for sure, but reading through the book for the first time, you know, if someone had told me, oh, this is like the first book on horary, that wouldn't have, you know, jived me the wrong way. That would have made sense. Mm-hmm. It's not kind of presented that way, but it certainly seems like it is. You know, so maybe, I don't know, maybe our definitions are wrong, or maybe we're kind of squinting the wrong way at some of the texts.
Yeah, no, it opens up a really powerful research question that I think could be useful to re-examine in terms of the crossovers between various ancient astrologies. And obviously the perfection of something, you know, takes centuries, but it doesn't mean that the earlier iterations of it weren't that thing. It's just a different form.
Yeah, and you know, just to like clarify for our listeners, if you look at anthologies by Valens, or if you look at Firmicus Maternus's Mathesis, it's pretty obvious that none of the material in there comes close to Horary. The same cannot be said of Dorotheus. So yes, it does warrant further investigation, Jen.
Well, and then we say translation of this into this versus this, and it's sort of like, well, can we trace perhaps, and I haven't done research into the roots of Horary by any means, but it's sort of, as things get translated, certain people add and subtract, and there becomes this illusion of what was the quote unquote original, as if that's a thing that can be found, version of this, right? And so in the many copies that we have still, it's the extant copies, it's not the ones that got destroyed in some fashion. So there could be a later edition of Horary-ish into a thing that didn't have when Dorotheus was composing, maybe? It's an open question. It doesn't need to be decided.
Oh, hello. I lost connection with you for a second. But I'm
Dorotheus is spanking us now. He's being, how dare you suggest that? Okay, so nevertheless. So yeah, no, that's a really, okay, so you want to get off the island as soon as possible. We can leave the island now.
I didn't say that. I said I want the option. I just like having options.
Yeah, right? Not as soon as possible, as soon as the election allows.
Maybe. I'll build the boat when the election comes round, and I'll maybe keep it on land. And if I decide I do want to get off, I'll use the appropriate one to push it into the water and find somewhere else to check out.
All right, good. Awesome. Lovely. Very, very subtly enjoyable, actually, the way that you're using this magic in very practical ways instead of this, like, I want to be the world's richest man, loved by all. It's like, no, I just want to eat and have some mobility.
Sometimes it's the basics, right? The little things in life.
Yeah. So if you are going to steward a new person through the annals of astrology land and give them some things to begin with, where would you steer them first, textually?
Yeah, great question. So I would, of course, refer them to Estelle Daniels' astrological magic that we looked at the very beginning. Because, there are things in there you won't find all put into one place elsewhere. And it was a useful introduction. However, I am, of a traditional and largely Hellenistic bent in my astrology these days. So it would be inappropriate of me not to recommend this massive tome, Chris Brennan's Fate and Fortune, the study of, I've said that backwards, Hellenistic astrology, the study of fate and fortune. And it's a brilliant one because, and it's very thick here, it's, almost 4 centimeters in if you look at the spine thickness. It's a brilliant one because there is more than enough context as to the history and development of what we call astrology. And then you have, for the most part, a clean overview of all of the basic concepts that are used in Hellenistic astrology, at least by modern practitioners today. So it would be a good introduction for those wanting to go down the Hellenistic path. And it is quite enjoyable to read as well, which is always helpful.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, that is one of the bigger books here. Alan Clay's Sedna definitely beats everybody because that book is so big. Actually, you might be able to see it behind me. It's so it's just everything, 800 pages of Sedna. But Chris's book, I remember I was like, I think I need to build a fort with this. Maybe we should also bring that to the island so we can have a shelter, right? Because it's so big.
Yes, it would provide adequate shelter, yes, for quite some time.
Yeah. And the translation of Valens is also equally large, on par with some of these more recent books. Is that the only place you would send someone to start this, Estelle?
No, I've got another 2 here. Sorry, I should say I've got another 2. So because the thing is, like, it is a very good introduction, but it's not everything is there. Mm-hmm. So for instance, we were talking about zodiacal releasing earlier. There's a very brief introduction to that. Mm-hmm. And most of the stuff there, well, at least the more complex things. So you can begin to get an understanding of how to read lots, for instance, Hermetic lots. But it's not quite, the perspective you would get if you read specifically how Valens delineates lots in his own text. So good place to start for Hellenistic astrologers. The other one, I just can't help but recommend the earliest books that I read, right? So the 36 Faces, I'm holding it up for the second time now. I would have to recommend this because it gave me a unique perspective as a second book I ever read. It gave me a unique perspective of the zodiac. I think it's very easy for newcomers to perceive everything, at least in the sky, as broken into 12 slices of a heavenly pizza. And it's not quite like that. When you have read the book 36 Faces, you see more of a story in each of the 12, and you honestly start thinking about them more as 36, which have kind of more pronounced borders in every trio. And so it definitely gave me a more nuanced understanding of how the zodiac kind of progresses. Certain stories are told in each 10-degree period, and with enough reads and rereads, you start to get a sense already of, oh well, yeah, this will be in this story I'm experiencing in life fits into this 10-degree window as opposed to that one. So it's very good for that kind of zodiacal detail, let's say. And again, obviously not available anywhere else.
Yeah.
Most of the historical texts on the decans are, oh, this is the name of the spirit, and it's someone with this many arms, and they're holding these objects. It doesn't tell you anything about it zodiacally. It's telling you about like what the spirit or egregore of that 10-degree window is like. So yeah, that's a must read, I would say. Yeah. Those two go together very well, very complementary.
Well, you're reminding me just quickly to keep with Austin for a minute, that's the way in which he's gathered various world traditions underneath each decan allows you to get a sense of the comparative astrologies out there from the beginning, and not be, I think of it like a little chicken, like, you're my mommy, right? Like you're not cathecting onto the first astrological culture you encounter. You're immediately thrust into this world where you're like, well, am I going to go Persian, or am I going to go, Hellenistic, or am I going to, and so you get this sense of the immensity of the various traditions. And so you have to then fracture your vision in a way and get instantly stereoscopic with how you see things,
Yes. Yeah. There is, it's beautiful to see the similarities and subtle differences, and sometimes very pronounced differences between, the various images as they're presented in the Yavana Janaka, or, by Agrippa, or in whatever, Liber Hermetis, right? And so the place I feel I got to it, and I mean, I sort of have been reading it on and off nonstop since I got it in 2014, hot off the press. You get to a point where, or at least I got to a point where, you see the kind of hall of mirrors reflections of all these different cultures throughout time. And then you come to begin to understand that what is emanating all of those images is kind of more of an amorphous shape or feeling, or accumulation of feelings, or stories yet untold, stories already told. And there's, this is why the decans I think are so fascinating, is that you can pull new images out of that amorphous blob I've described. And there's one of those for each of the decans. Let's not get it wrong. The 36 amorphous blobs that generate stories and experience and images. And we'll continue to synthesize and rediscover and channel and receive these forms, these 36 forms, in new ways as we progress as species here on the planet.
Yeah. The poet Brian Wilkins actually went on a 3-year journey to do that, and only wrote poems during the sun's pathway through each of the decans.
Oh.
And created a small book of poetry called A Wheel of Small Gods. And so he's precipitated those newer images through his mind, and with the intention of the healing powers of these amorphous blobs, as you've called them. Because I like the way you've sort of gone back to sort of the commonalities that underpin these different emanations that have been fixed in certain cultural forms.
Yeah, because all of the images are they have the context of what was relevant to the culture at the time that they perceived the decan. So I feel as though, because the decans are in some way more alive than other segments of the zodiac we can look at, we'll get more of those and more variations in those. And I need to put Brian's book on my wish list. Thank you for mentioning that.
It's just nice to see, you're calling out like, we're going to still do this. And I'm like, we literally are doing it now. There are poets engaging with these now and doing it in an astrologically sensitive way to say, hey, tap, 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 what are you? Like, and then blah, out comes a poem. And it's just like,
incredible. Incredible.
So...
That's amazing. Thank you. So I have one more beginners.
Okay.
And this really is more of when you've read the other three and you feel like you've grasped it somewhat. The final one, this is another translation from the Venerable Ben Dykes. This is Abu Mashar's Great Introduction to the Science of the Judgment of the Stars, but most people just call it the Great Introduction. And I really like this because there's so much in it. Again, it's very easy to read. And, Ben's just done a brilliant job because he has so many footnotes on each page that either provide clarity, or he's talking about, well, this is the word in Arabic and it could mean this or this. And I feel that we're going more in this direction. It's just, there's so much in it. And in terms of, looking at some of the things in Estelle Daniels' book, particularly like separating, applying aspects, right? You can go so much further with this book. And there's things I didn't even know were done in astrology, frankly, in terms of how one planet transmits light to another, and the interplays and the specificity of that, and under what conditions, and the phrase we call it by, right? And they all have different monikers. But there's almost everything in here, and it's not too long. Neither is it too heavy. It's excellent. I can't say anything else about it at the moment. I think it's just a great one to have on the shelf and to refer to when you need more information on a particular area of study.
Yes. And I love that you've pushed people into the medieval zone, because I feel like to stop at Hellenistic is to sell oneself a bit short. There's so much that gets done in the medieval work that I use consistently and constantly. So I'm glad that even though you have a Hellenistic base, you're nudging newer astrologers to get medieval.
Yeah, for sure. I think you do need a fuller picture, as you say, right? And I think the astrologers of Abu Mashar's time probably might have felt they were doing the same thing as the Hellenistic astrologers. There is a continuity in some sense, I feel. But it is remarkable also to compare, Jen, like the difference, for example, in how lots are interpreted by Abu Mashar versus Valens. And Valens is very it's a much more straightforward lot and lord approach and angles, and it all revolves around the law of fortune. And even Firmicus has a very different approach where he focuses on the bound lords in addition to the domicile lords. And then you have to make sure the bound lord and the domicile lord see each other, otherwise not so good. And then in Abu Mashar, you get a very different approach, which is almost more scientific in a sense. So you need to have not only the lord of the lot configured to the lot, preferably, but then you want to look at the constituents of the calculation. So if the lot is, let's say the lot involves Venus and Mercury, preferably Venus and Mercury were both in a beneficial aspect to the lot in question. And if you have that in addition to the lord of the lot, great, excellent. So yeah, I just like sitting with the different perspectives that each of these authors and time periods can offer us. And you kind of get to sit and decide for yourself, or pick and choose when you feel one approach might be more beneficial than another when you're engaging in some particular work, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I also think it's like flavor. How can you say, well, I like this flavor, this spice, I like, cured sumac more than I like tarragon. Like, how is that even a comparison? You know when to use it, when it's right, and so just to be having a full spectrum of experience to know, oh, in this chart I really actually need some more Abu Mashar's lots versus the Firmicus, etc. And then I would say too, knowing the philosophical foundations of what a bound lord is, I don't think that those are getting enough attention, but that's having to do with the material manifestation of a thing. And if that's not at stake, then maybe Firmicus's work is not important to answer this question, right?
Yeah.
But if you're
Yeah,
looking at the
exactly.
material manifestation of something, then maybe Abu Mashar can be left to the side and you will pick up the Maternus one, you know. So
Indeed.
anyways, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and wisdom and self with us.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on today.
Yeah. And where can people find you if they want to chase up with you and not barrel down your door and say, teach us more?
Yes, I can be found at keys2astrology.com. That's the number 2. You can find me there. My email is attached there, and you can write to me. You can ask me questions if you would like a reading or something. You can email me about that or other things. But yeah, that's where I can be found. That's the place to go. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Jed. Take care.